Alma Angeles, and you're watching Eagle News International. Joining me today is Ms. CJ Hero. Good evening, CJ.
Good evening, Alma, and good evening to everyone watching the news. Here are the top headlines.
The Department of Foreign Affairs reported that no Filipino has been reported to be among the casualties in the escalating exchange of airstrikes and rocket fires between Israel and Palestinian militant group Hamas.
The major U.S. pipeline network forced offline by a cyber attack began to reopen Wednesday, its operators said, after a 5-day shutdown prompted motorists to frantically stock up on gasoline and some gas stations on the U.S. East Coast to close.
The National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea on Wednesday said a maritime patrol on May 9 spotted the presence of 287 Chinese maritime militia vessels scattered over the various features of the municipality of Kalayaan.
And deep underground in eastern France, a 4-legged bundle of energy named Scar steps gingerly through vast caverns loaded with sensors for taking measures in places where humans might fear to tread.
First, to the ongoing crisis in the Middle East, the DFA said no Filipino has been reported to be among the casualties in the escalating exchange of airstrikes and rocket fires between Israel and Palestinian militant group Hamas. That according to the Department of Foreign Affairs. Now, in a statement, the agency also assured that the Philippine government has contingency plans in place for any developments in Israel, where a total of 29,473 Filipinos are currently working and residing. The DFA said that the embassy in Israel has not received any report of Filipino casualties, and the embassy is in touch with Filipino organizations and networks. Shelters are there to provide refuge, including for Filipino workers. In a separate statement dated May 11, the Philippine Embassy in Tel Aviv advised the Filipino community in Israel to stay vigilant and postpone or cancel travel plans to places near the border of Gaza. It also asked them to avoid going to the West Bank, which is in Bethlehem, Jericho, Hebron, and other areas, and the following areas in Jerusalem, especially on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. If possible, the embassy said the Filipino community must not approach the Israeli security force stationed in the mentioned sensitive areas. The embassy also advised Filipinos residing in the country to find the nearest bomb shelter or protected area from the residents and head there when the need arises. Among others, they were urged to take extra precautions when riding public vehicles and were advised to stay behind the metal cement barriers away from other passengers when waiting for their ride. The DFA advised them to take shelter to a safer place immediately if they hear a gunshot or see a commotion. If traveling, they're advised to take caution and position the head lower than the car's window.
Meanwhile, Israeli security forces fire stun grenades and tear gas at young Palestinian demonstrators in Hebron in the occupied West Bank. The city is a flashpoint where some 800 Jewish settlers, mostly driven by ideological conviction, live under heavy military protection among 200,000 Palestinians. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz ordered a massive reinforcement of security forces to help contain deadly internal unrest that has rocked mixed Jewish and Arab communities across the country. He also specified the forces would be reservists from Israel's border police, a force that largely operates in the occupied West Bank. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described the violence as anarchy and convened the emergency cabinet meeting that lasted into the early hours of Thursday to give more powers to the police and enforce curfews as needed. Police are now cracking down on protesters in Israeli cities. Tensions have soared over Israel's planned eviction of Palestinians from a district in annexed East Jerusalem, with the Jewish state sees as a part of its eternal capital, but is considered occupied by the United Nations.
Meanwhile, we have on the line joining us is Mr. Bernardo Carpio, a Filipino resident in Israel. And he will tell us more about what he sees in Israel right now. Magandang gabi po. Pwede ko ba kayong tawaging Ka Bernard?
Magandang gabi po sa ating lahat po. Opo, pwede po.
Pwede po. Opo. Ka Bernard, pwede ho bang ikwento nyo sa amin kung ano po ang nangyayari ngayon dyan at ano po ang nakikita ninyo?
Sa nangyayari po dito sa kasalukuyan sa Israel ay sa ibang bahagi po ng Israel, lalo na sa malapit sa Gaza, ay magulo po at sa bandang Jerusalem. Subalit yun sa aming pong lugar ay mga 50 kilometers away po from Gaza. Pero nakakaabot po rito yung mga rockets po na pinapadala ng mga tinatawag na Hamas. Kaya po yung nakaraang 2 araw o 2 gabi na nagpapadala sila, nagsisend ng rockets po dito, ay hindi po natutulog ang karamihan dito po sa city po namin sa Bnei Brak, malapit po sa Tel Aviv. Dahil binabantayan kapag ka nag-siren na po, yun po ang warning na kailangan within 60 seconds po ay makahanap ng lugar na safe. Kung walang shelter po sa bahay, ay kung nasa building, maaari lang po silang lumabas doon po sa may bandang may hagdanan po. Kung may shelter naman po ang mga apartment, ay doon po sila pumupunta sa kanilang mga shelter. At gayon din po ay nasaksihan din po namin kung paano ma-intercept ng tinatawag nilang Iron Dome, yung po mga rockets po na pinapasabog po sa itaas. Pero hindi po lahat po ay na-intercept po ng Iron Dome, kasi po ay sobrang dami po ng mga rockets na hindi po talaga marami, as yun sobrang dami po. Kaya meron pong nami-miss na ma-intercept ang Iron Dome. Kaya tulad po kagabi, ang huli po ay meron pong isang building dito malapit sa city namin ang tinamaan po ng rockets po. Kaya sumabog po yung buong building po na yon. At wala naman po napaulat na may Pilipino po doon sa building. Subalit doon po sa tabi ng building na yon ay may mga caregivers po na nagtatrabaho po doon. Talagang natakot po sila. At sa awa po ng Diyos ay ligtas naman ng mga Pilipino po dito sa Israel po at dito po sa city namin.
Okay, Ka Bernard, kasama ko po si CJ Hero. Baka ho merong gusto siyang itanong sa inyo. CJ.
Magandang araw po sa inyo, Ka Bernard, dyan sa Israel. I just have a couple of questions. Yung una po ay, kamusta po yung supply natin ng pagkain sa mga groceries natin? Nagkakaroon po ba ng panic buying ang mga tao dyan pagdating po sa pagbili ng mga basic necessities natin?
Sa ngayon po, wala naman pong panic buying at okay naman po ang pan po ng mga pagkain dito, ang supply. Ang yun lamang po nagiging problema from time to time po ay meron ng mga rockets. Pero yung pagkain po ay walang problema po.
Paano naman?
Yun naman.
Sige po. Sige, go ahead.
If-follow up question ko na lang din po, no? Kasi sa kaguluhan po na nangyayari dyan, usually hindi po natin maiiwasan na may magkakaroon ng pagtaas ng mga presyo ng mga bilihin dahil nai-interrupt po yung flow ng goods natin dahil sa kaguluhan. May naramdaman na ho ba kayong pagbabago pagdating sa presyo po or sa ngayon stable pa naman po?
Dito naman po sa bansang Israel, kapag po may gulong tulad nito, ay hindi naman po sila nagtataas ng mga paninda. At ang katunayan nga po niyan ay nagbibigay pa rin sila ng libreng pagkain sa mga halimbawang hindi nakakapagtrabaho. Dulot po nung kaguluhan po.
So ang last question na lang po. So ang sinasabi niyo po, merong interruption kahit na medyo malayo po kayo sa area. Sabi niyo kanina 50 kilometers away kayo dun sa sentro ng kaguluhan dyan. May interruption pa rin na nangyayari po sa daily routine niyo, like sa mga trabaho po?
Meron din po kasi ang ibang amo po ay natatakot din na baka kung papapuntahin ng mga kanilang mga manggagawa ay biglang may dumating na racket sa daan ng kanila pong pagpunta sa hanap buhay, ay kung tinasabi po nila ay konsensya din nila at ginagawa na lang po nila ay hindi na po papupuntahin yung kanilang nagtatrabaho sa kanila. Pero yun naman po mga caregivers na stay in po sa mga amo ay wala naman pong problema.
Okay, maraming salamat ka, Alma. May question pa po kayo.
Opo. Ano po ba, meron ho bang mensahe sa inyo ang ang Israeli Embassy or ang ating Philippine Embassy po dyan? Ano po ba ang pinagagawa sa inyong pag-iingat po?
Una po, ang Philippine Embassy po ay naglalabas po sila ng mga nag-a-announce po sila na kapag may kaguluhan po tulad ng ganito ay iwasan po ang pumunta sa mga matataong lugar. Kung hindi naman po kinakailangan lumabas at hindi mahalaga ang pupuntahan, mas makabubuti po mag-stay na lang sa kanilang mga tahanan po. Gayon din po ang Israeli government, yun din po ang sinasabi po na iwasan ang mga matataong lugar, lalo na yung mga affected po ng mga maraming rockets at malapit po dun sa borders.
Alright, marami po tayong kababayan dyan. Maraming salamat po sa inyo, Ka Bernard. At kung meron po kayong mga updates, maaari po ba namin kayong matawagan ulit sa mga developments na nangyayari po dyan?
Opo, anytime po at kinagagalak po namin na makapagbigay din po ng informasyon po sa mga kababayan natin na mga nangyayari po dito sa Israel. At sa kasalukuyan po, kahit na magulo dito ay okay pa naman po ang mga Pilipino dito. At masaya pa rin. Sabi nga ay hindi po naapekto sa ganitong mga sitwasyon. Sinasabi nga po ay sa Israel po normal na po yung ganito na may rockets at kasi nga po ay sa hindi pagkakaintindihan ng dalawang nasyon po na yan ng tinatawag natin yung Palestina at Israeli. Pero hindi naman po naapektuhan yung mga manggagawang Pilipino po dito. Yun lamang po ay minsan may takot din. May takot din sa kanila pero as of now po, safe naman po ang mga Pilipino po. Sawa po ng Diyos.
Diretso lang, po. Maraming salamat po, Ka Bernard, at mag-iingat po kayo.
Maraming salamat din po at magandang araw po, umaga o gabi po.
Okay. Maraming salamat, Mr. Bernardo Carpio, a Filipino resident in Israel. Meanwhile, we received a statement from the Israeli Embassy, and let us read this to you. Since 6 p.m. IST on Monday, May 10th, over 1,100 rockets have been launched at Israel, deliberately targeting civilian populations in southern Israel, Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv, while the Iron Dome defense system was able to intercept a large proportion of them. Around 90% of those directed at civilian population centers. Rockets, unfortunately, did make contact in several locations, killing 7 Israelis, among them a 5-year-old boy, and injuring hundreds. A rocket has hit and damaged a school, which was fortunately empty at the time due to necessary measures being taken to protect the children. The responsibility for the violence unfolding in Jerusalem, Gaza, and the rest of Israel falls entirely on the terrorist organization Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terror supporters. Israel said the terrorist organization Hamas is attempting to overwhelm the Iron Dome by firing hundreds of rockets simultaneously. However, the real tragic consequence is that 1/3 of such rockets fired end up endangering the very people they claim to protect, ordinary, everyday Gazans. And Israel said the Ben Gurion Airport has temporarily halted inbound and outbound flights. Schools have been closed in many parts of the country. 1 million Israeli children cannot attend school. And they said, we call on the international community to unequivocally condemn and demand that the Palestinians cease their rocket fire as well as terror activities against Israeli civilians, to recognize Israel's right to protect its citizens. And they said, we call all overseas Filipino workers who are in Israel to listen to the safety instructions and strictly follow the directives of the IDF Home Front Command.
Back to COVID news now. Switzerland plans to ease more restrictions. We have Christine Benedicto from our EBC Geneva Bureau joining us live. Please tell us more.
Hello, CJ. Thank you for having me. Yesterday, Switzerland announced that they will be easing more coronavirus restrictions. Restaurants may be able to serve food indoors, and larger events may take place starting on May 31st. The openings will only happen, however, if Switzerland's coronavirus numbers remain under control until May 26th, the day when the decision will be made after the consultation with all the Swiss cantons. Restaurants will be allowed to serve people indoors at tables of up to 4 people. And the quarantine for those already vaccinated will also be dropped. People who have recovered from COVID-19 and those who have been vaccinated will be exempt from contact and travel quarantine. The number of people allowed to gather in indoor events will increase from 50 to 100 people, while the cap on outdoor gatherings will increase from 100 to 300 people. A maximum of 30 people rather than 15 will be allowed to participate in outdoor sports. The decision was made on the basis of a 3-phase reopening plan that the government outlined in April. Indoor sports without a mask will be capped at 15 people, and contact sports, just judo or wrestling, for example, are only allowed indoors without a mask in groups of 4 people. The area requirement for quiet indoor sports will be adjusted from 50 to 10 square meters per person, and wellness centers and thermal baths will again be allowed to open. However, only 1 person per 15 square meters will be allowed. Working from home, currently a requirement under Swiss law, will again become a simple recommendation. In schools, meanwhile, the cap on university lectures of 50 students will also be scrapped, provided the universities put in place effective contact tracing solutions. Switzerland began easing its anti-COVID-19 restrictions on March 1st, when non-essential shops and museums reopened to the public. That's today's update from Switzerland. Back to you, CJ.
Thank you so much, Christine, for your update. And of course, we're hoping that everything falls into place for the easing of restrictions to happen smoothly.
All right. Thank you so much again. Thank you for having me as well. Thank you. I'm Christine Benedicto from Geneva, Switzerland. We live in interesting times.
Now to Japan, they said, or the country plans to speed up the vaccination of all elderly people over the coming months, plus an update on the Olympics and travel ban. Here's Dennis Liu for all those for his report. Dennis.
Good evening, Alma. Japan said it plans to speed up the vaccination of all elderly people over the coming months. We are currently experiencing a 4th wave of COVID infections. And starting this week, the government has requested that 1,490 local municipalities prepare to inoculate 9 million people in 2 weeks. As the world's most rapidly aging society, Japan has a mammoth task of inoculating 36 million elderly people. In Japan, daily coronavirus infections topped 6,000 for the 3rd consecutive day this week. Also, for the first time, 18 deaths outside a hospital were recorded in Osaka. The number of seriously ill patients in Japan has also hit a record high of 1,189 cases. Japan started its vaccine program for healthcare workers on February 17th, but only a quarter of medical personnel have received 2 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Inoculations for the elderly began on April 12, and a month later, only 1% of the elderly population, about 240,000 people, have received their first dose. In another development, Japanese superstar Naomi Osaka has admitted she is not really sure the coronavirus hit Tokyo Olympics should go ahead. The four-time tennis Grand Slam winner joined fellow Japanese player Kei Nishikori in raising concerns as Tokyo and other parts of Japan remain under a virus state of emergency. Nishikori also said there definitely should be a discussion on whether Tokyo should go ahead. A survey by a leading Japanese daily release on Monday found 59% of respondents want the Olympics cancelled, underlining persistent public concerns over the risk of infections. Olympic officials insist the Games can still be held safely and have released rule books they say will ensure the biggest international event since the pandemic began does not spread the virus. Meanwhile, an update on travel, Alma. The Japanese government has decided to further tighten entry restrictions by banning foreign residents who are traveling from India, Nepal, or Pakistan. Until recently, foreign nationals with a valid resident status as well as Japanese citizens who had traveled to these three countries were allowed to re-enter Japan on the condition that they spent the first 6 days of a 2-week quarantine at a government-designated facility. In the midst of Japan's third state of emergency, however, officials have decided to temporarily deny re-entry to foreign residents who are flying in from those countries. This is due to the COVID-19 spike in the region caused by new coronavirus variants. The entry ban will take effect Friday, May 14th. It is unclear as to how long the restriction will be in place for. Japanese nationals will still be able to re-enter the country. This is the latest for now. Reporting from Tokyo, Japan, this is Dennis Liu. We live in interesting times.
To the U.S. now, where the New York Governor Andrew Cuomo announced that most of New York's pandemic-era restrictions will now be lifted. As COVID-19 positivity rates, now around 2%, continue to fall. Let's find out more from Joanne Soriano from our EBC New York Bureau. Joanne.
New York City is in the process of reopening in a big way. The statewide 7-day average positivity rate has declined for 37 straight days, with the positivity rate for New York City dropping to 0.86%, the first time under 1% since October 14th. Warmer temperatures are bringing more people out of their homes, onto the sidewalks and into parks, restaurants, and businesses, bringing life back to the city that never sleeps. First up, the lights of Broadway are turning back on after going dark at the start of the pandemic. Governor Cuomo announced that the show will go on, beginning September 14th. Tickets are on sale now for popular shows like Hamilton, Wicked, Aladdin, and The Lion King. Theaters will be at 100% capacity in accordance with state health and safety guidelines. Restaurant owners who have had to deal with constantly changing regulations were able to open their indoor dining to 75% capacity last week. The midnight curfew for food and beverage service will be lifted on May 17th for outdoor dining areas and on May 31st for indoor dining. Subway service will resume 24-hour service starting May 17. New York City Transit is currently closed from 2 to 4 a.m. daily for disinfection. Last Friday, the MTA recorded 2.23 million subway riders, the most on a single day since the pandemic began. Mask use remains mandatory on MTA subways and buses. More good news for bookworms as well. 14 locations in the Queens Public Library system moved from only to-go service to Stage 2 of the reopening plan. These branches will now allow customers to browse the book collections, access reference services, and utilize computers and printers. Tourists are also returning to the Big Apple. Domestic travelers arriving in New York no longer have to quarantine for 14 days. Visitors should monitor their symptoms for 14 days and contact a public health authority or their health provider if symptoms develop. Stay tuned as New York City continues to shift its focus on safely rebuilding the economy in this new normal. In New York, Joanne Soriano, Eagle News. We live in interesting times. Back to you.
Thank you for your report. In the U.S. now, the Centers for Disease Control has approved the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine in children aged 12 to 15. U.S. President Joe Biden urged parents to get their children vaccinated following the CDC's authorization. Watch this.
Good afternoon. Later today, we're going to have for the first time a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine for adolescents over the 12 years of age. And this is one more giant step on our fight against the pandemic. I sincerely think the scientists, researchers, and clinical trial participants deserve our thanks. They've all made this possible. The bottom line is this. The vaccine for kids between the ages of 12 and 15 are safe, effective, easy, fast, and free. So my hope is that parents will take advantage of the vaccine and get their kids vaccinated.
Pfizer and its partner BioNTech said in March that their two-dose vaccine regimen was shown to be safe and highly effective in a trial of 2,260 12 to 15-year-olds. Some 20,000 pharmacies around the country were ready to begin to vaccinate adolescents, President Biden said, and doses will also be shipped to pediatricians. COVID-19 vaccines from Moderna and Johnson & Johnson have also received emergency use authorizations from the FDA, but only for individuals over the age of 18.
And back here in the country's overall coronavirus disease or COVID-19 recovery count has now reached 1,050,643 with an additional 4,289 recoveries today. In its latest bulletin, the Department of Health said those who have beaten the illness account for 93.4% of the Philippines' total case tally of 1,124,724. The agency also reported 6,385 new confirmed cases and 107 new deaths. Now, these figures brought the overall tally of active cases to 55,260 and the death toll to 18,821. The latest figures showed 93.3% of the active cases are mild, 2.2% are asymptomatic, 1.9% are severe, 1.18% are moderate, and 1.14% are in critical condition. DOH data on May 11 likewise showed that 13.6% of 44,345 who were tested turned out positive for COVID-19.
Staying here in the Philippines, the government continues its COVID vaccination rollout following the recent arrival of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine supplies through a symbolic vaccination at the Makati Medical Center in Makati City today. Take a look.
We are very happy to be here on behalf of WHO and the COVAX facility. The arrival of Pfizer vaccines on the 10th of May to the Philippines is indeed a milestone. This is the first shipment of Pfizer vaccines. We expect significantly larger shipments in the next few weeks. We only know that the vaccines are effective against preventing severe disease and death. So it is still important that even though we are vaccinated, we continue to follow the minimum public health standards of hand hygiene, mask wearing, face shields, physical distancing, avoiding closed, crowded, congested settings.
My name is Michelle Langali and I represent the U.S. Embassy, but I'm also the health director for USAID, which is the U.S. government's main humanitarian and development organization. And we are very proud to be the largest donor by far to the COVAX facility. And we're excited that we're going to be supporting through the COVAX 20% of the vaccinations here in the Philippines. So that's 1 in 5 persons we will be supporting.
So far, we have vaccinated over 2.5 million Filipinos. Belongs to A1, A2, and A3. A total of 6.4 million doses have been deployed across the country, with 3,446 vaccination centers have been activated. With the steady arrival of the vaccines, we expect to receive 7,753,450 doses in May and 10,050,000 in June, which will bring our total vaccine supply to 21,829,050. We expect this number to significantly increase in the coming months.
On the evening of May 10, the Philippines welcomed the arrival of 193,050 doses of COVID-19 vaccines from Pfizer-BioNTech, the fourth vaccine brand made available to the nation against the virus. It is also the country's first shipment of doses from the American pharmaceutical company through the COVAX facility.
And the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea today said a maritime patrol on May 9 spotted the presence of 287 Chinese maritime militia or CMM vessels scattered over the various features of the municipality of Kalayaan, both within and outside the exclusive economic zone of the country. Bigger groupings of CMMs were sighted at the artificial islands built by China, while some were observed near islands occupied by the Philippines, according to a statement signed by the NTF-WPS Chair and National Security Advisor Hermogenes Esperon. Now, Esperon also said despite China's illegal unilateral fishing ban covering its fishing vessels in waters north of 12 degrees latitude in the South China Sea from May 1 to August 16, 2 CMMs were nonetheless observed harvesting shells inside the lagoon of the Bajo de Masinloc. An average of 10 Filipino fishing boats have also been seen inside the lagoon from May 7 to May 9. The NTF-WPS has encouraged Filipinos to fish in the area and ignore the Chinese fishing ban. The Philippines also said China's unilateral fishing ban in the South China Sea doesn't apply to areas within the Southeast Asian nations or within the Philippines. Now, these were more than the 220 CMM vessels that had swarmed the Julian Felipe or Whitsun Reef in March and then later dispersed to other parts of the West Philippine Sea. The presence of the Chinese vessels then had triggered severe or several diplomatic protests against Chinese incursions into Philippine waters.
Staying here in the Philippines, Pagasa said a weather disturbance, Krising, has intensified into a tropical storm as it heads towards Davao Occidental and Surigao del Sur. Tropical storm Krising will continue to bring rains over parts of Mindanao and Palawan, according to the Weather Bureau on Thursday afternoon. Caraga, Davao Region, Northern Mindanao, Soccergen, Bangsamoro, and Palawan will experience moderate to heavy rains likely until Friday. Pagasa said isolated to scattered flooding and rain-induced landslides are possible during heavy or prolonged rainfall. Signal number 2 has been hoisted over the southern portion of Surigao del Sur, the southern portion of Agusan del Sur, the northern portion of Davao Oriental, the northern portion of Davao de Oro, and the northern portion of Davao del Norte. Signal number 1, on the other hand, has been hoisted over the southeastern portion of Negros Oriental and Siquijor, Surigao del Norte, including Bucas Grande and Siargao Islands, the rest of Surigao del Sur, the rest of Agusan del Sur, Agusan del Norte, the rest of Davao Oriental, the rest of Davao de Oro, the rest of Davao del Norte, Davao City, Bukidnon, Lanao del Sur and Lanao del Norte, Misamis Occidental, Misamis Oriental, Camiguin, and the northeastern portion of Zamboanga del Sur.
And we now go to Nepal, where 5 people suffocated in a hospital after oxygen ran out this week. Just the latest victims of a vicious COVID surge that risks devastating the impoverished country and its ill-equipped healthcare system. Daily new cases have risen 60-fold since April 1, and nearly 1,000 people have died in the past 10 days, according to official figures, which, as in neighboring India, are seen as underreporting the scale level of the virus. The mountainous country of almost 30 million is now seeing severe cases. Flood hospitals as oxygen cylinders empty faster than they can be refilled, and almost half of those tested return positive. In the capital, Kathmandu, several hospitals have said they can no longer admit new patients, turning away desperate relatives looking for beds for infected loved ones. And Nepal's prime minister now faces accusations that he missed a window of opportunity to stem the virus spread, allowing public gatherings and international travel, even as cases soar to devastating levels across the border in India. Now, Samir Kumar Adhikari, chief of the Health Ministry's Health Emergency Operations Center, said that the country is now in a crisis situation. Nepal has now turned to China for help, this week sending an aircraft to pick up the first 400 out of a promised 20,000 oxygen cylinders and other supplies. Beijing has also provided 800,000 coronavirus vaccines to Nepal.
In other news, the Department of Homeland Security has just created a new Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships and additional efforts to comprehensively combat domestic violent extremism. Bureau Chief Eliza Gonzalez Manglikmot reports from Washington, D.C.
The Department of Homeland Security is taking another step in its fight against terrorism, this time by focusing its efforts on combating domestic violent extremism. Now, the DHS is doing this by establishing a new Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, or what is being called CP3. Now, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro N. Mayorkas announced the formation of CP3 on Tuesday, May 11th. Mayorkas says CP3 will help build local prevention frameworks to provide communities with the tools they need to combat terrorism and targeted violence. He further says individuals who may be radicalizing or have radicalized to violence typically exhibit behaviors that are recognizable to many but are best understood by those closest to them, such as friends, family, and classmates. The center looks to communities and friends and family members of individuals who show a tendency of being radicalized to speak up and help prevent potential domestic terrorism acts. CP3 aims to empower communities and individuals to be resilient to violent messaging and recruitment. One way it plans to do this is by addressing early risk factors that can lead to radicalization to violence. The newly formed center not only aims to prevent attacks, such as the assault on the U.S. Capitol, but also attacks on schools, workplaces, and public gatherings. In addition to CP3, Secretary Mayorkas announces a new dedicated domestic terrorism branch within the department's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, or I&A. The branch will focus on producing sound, timely intelligence needed to combat threats posed by domestic terrorism and targeted violence. The creation of CP3 and the I&A Domestic Terrorism Branch are the latest actions DHS is taking to comprehensively battle domestic violent extremism, including violent white supremacy. While Manar Wahid, ACLU Senior Legislative and Advocacy Counsel, agrees with the need to fighting white supremacist violence, Wahid criticizes the formation of CP3. Wahid says despite promises to end violent extremism programs that were ineffective, discriminatory, and harmful to Muslims and communities of color, President Biden's administration appears to be expanding these efforts and simply renaming them. CP3 replaces the targeted violence and terrorism prevention created during the Trump administration. Today, Secretary Mayorkas is scheduled to meet with lawmakers alongside Attorney General Merrick Garland to discuss their efforts to combat domestic terrorism. In Washington, Eliza Gonzalez Manglikmot, Eagle News. We live in interesting times.
Thank you, Eliza. CJ and I will be back right after this break.
Protect yourself and loved ones. Use Protect Plus Gold, a broad-spectrum disinfectant that kills 500 strains of bacteria, fungi, and viruses such as coronavirus and other disease-causing microorganisms. Also potent against viruses in pets. It kills 99.9% of disease-causing germs and works in 10 minutes. Dissolve 1 teaspoon in 1 liter of water. Apply on areas for disinfection or use it for misting. Protect Plus Gold.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Welcome back. Fitch Solutions is keeping its 4% average inflation forecast for the Philippines this year amid the cut in the central bank's projection, but sees average inflation next year to decelerate to around 3.4%. In a report dated May 12, the unit of Fitch Group said these projections are above the midpoint of the government's 2 to 4% target band until 2023. On Wednesday, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas Policymaking Monetary Board slashed the central bank's 2021 average inflation forecast to 3.9% from 4.2%, but hiked the 2022 projection to 3% from 2.8%. The cut in this year's inflation projection factored in the impact of a lower tariff on pork importation, while the reason behind the change in next year's inflation projection is the rise in global oil prices. Domestic inflation is still elevated due to supply constraints on pork meat because of the African swine fever, among others, and the rise in global oil prices. It decelerated to 4.5% in March and remained steady in the following month.
Now, the major U.S. pipeline network forced offline by a cyber attack began to reopen Wednesday, according to its operator, after a 5-day shutdown prompted motorists to frantically stock up on gasoline and some gas stations on the U.S. East Coast to close. President Joe Biden earlier Wednesday tried to reassure Americans, saying his officials had been in very, very close contact with the company. Watch this. But a Colonial Pipeline warned that it will take several days before supplies return to normal. Faced with a growing shortage, late on Wednesday, the White House announced that it had waived the Jones Act, which blocks the use of non-U.S. flagged vessels, which are cheaper and more plentiful to transport fuel. It will be temporary and targeted to the company, Biden administration spokeswoman Jen Psaki said in a statement. A ransomware attack Friday on Colonial Pipeline forced the company to shut down its entire network, hampering supply in eastern states. But the company said late Wednesday it had initiated the restart of the pipeline operations today at approximately 5 p.m. ET or 2100 GMT. Those few stations with fuel available on Wednesday saw long car lines waiting to fill up. In Florida, 73% of stations in the Pensacola area were out of fuel, according to gas price tracking site Gas Buddy analyst Patrick DeHaan. In North Carolina's Raleigh-Durham area, 7 out of 10 stations ran out of gas, as did 6 in 10 around Georgia's capital, Atlanta.
Now, Hong Kong scrapped a plan to make coronavirus vaccines mandatory for foreign domestic workers after the proposal sparked an outcry and a diplomatic tussle. But before that, festive marches continue in Bogota and Medellin as thousands of demonstrators across Colombia to take to the streets again to protest against the government of Colombian President Ivan Duque in a crisis that erupted 2 weeks ago. Since April 28, hundreds of thousands of people have vented their frustrations against the government after poverty and violence soared during the pandemic. At least 42 people have been killed in near-daily protests against the Colombian government since April 28. The updated toll made these the bloodiest demonstrations since Colombia signed a peace agreement with the FARC guerrilla group in 2016, ending decades of civil war.
Meanwhile, Hong Kong scrapped a plan to make coronavirus vaccines mandatory for foreign domestic workers after the proposal sparked an outcry and diplomatic tussle. But authorities ordered all foreign helpers to undergo another round of mandatory testing, triggering renewed criticism from the Philippines. Health officials plan to roll out mandatory inoculations for the 370,000 domestic workers in the city, mostly poorly paid women from the Philippines and Indonesia. Those wanting to apply for work visas or renew their current ones would need to show they had received 2 doses. But on Tuesday, city leader Carrie Lam announced a U-turn. The government has decided not to request a mandatory vaccination when helpers renew their contracts, she said, adding the decision had been made after meetings with officials from the Philippines and Indonesia. Philippine Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin had previously said the initial proposal smacked of discrimination. Hong Kong health officials said domestic workers were high risk because they often work with the elderly and meet in parks on Sundays, usually their 1 day off a week.
And Amazon scored a major legal victory when an EU court annulled an order from the bloc's powerful antitrust authority that Luxembourg recoup 250 million euros in back taxes. Tax justice expert Tove Maria Riding said that she doesn't think today's decision is a victory for anyone. Let's listen in.
I don't think today's decision is a victory for anyone. The tax system is a mess, and if anything, this court case shows how difficult and uncertain it is to say what multinational corporations are going to pay in tax. That's not good for anyone. This is the absurd part of the case. Everyone agrees that Amazon set up tax structures in Luxembourg and lowered their tax payments because of that. Everyone agrees. But the question is whether that was legal. And today, the European Court of Justice has rejected the Commission's argument that this was a violation of the EU state aid rules. So at the moment, it looks like it wasn't illegal, but there's a big chance that the case will get appealed.
The case stems from a 2014 European Commission investigation into Amazon's tax arrangement in Luxembourg, which ultimately concluding that the country had granted undue tax benefits of around 250 million euros. EU Competition Commissioner Margrethe Vestager said the deal was illegal under EU rules because Amazon was allowed to pay substantially less tax than other businesses, and she ordered Luxembourg to recover the money.
In other news, Japanese billionaire entrepreneur Yusaku Maezawa and his assistant Yozo Hirano will be the next tourists to travel to the International Space Station, Russia's space agency Roscosmos said Thursday. Maezawa and Hirano will travel aboard a Russian Soyuz MS-20 spacecraft that is scheduled for launch on December 8, 2021 from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, the agency said in a statement. Maezawa, 45, who made his fortune in online retail, also plans to participate in a 2023 mission around the moon aboard a Starship spacecraft of SpaceX, the Roscosmos rival of U.S. billionaire Elon Musk. Maezawa and film producer Hirano, who will be documenting the mission, will begin pre-flight training in June at the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, a closed town outside of Moscow. It's said that the flight will last 12 days and the crew will be led by cosmonaut Alexander Misurkin.
And finally, in our news, deep underground in eastern France, a four-legged bundle of energy named SCAR steps gingerly through vast caverns loaded with sensors for taking measures in places where humans might fear to tread. It's an ideal training ground for SCAR, a robotic dog being groomed by researchers at the École des Mines or the Mine Engineering School in Nancy. Its name is a French acronym for Advanced Robotic Assistance System. And it was the first in France to purchase the Spot robot from the U.S. firm Boston Dynamics last September. On Tuesday, a team from the university tested out SCAR's abilities at the CGO lab 500 meters below the village of Bourg, slated to become a permanent home for thousands of tons of toxic waste from France's nuclear power plants. SCAR can also enter and inspect areas that are hard to reach or could expose humans to radiation risks. Students at the university will work on advanced AI applications for SCAR that will be tested at the lab.
So many things that we are able to do now with the robots. Imagine what will happen in the next 10 years. That's it. That's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I am CJ Hero. Please join us again tomorrow.
That's all we have to do. That's all the time we have for you today. At the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. I'm Alma Angeles, and we live in interesting times.